All right, Miamians and listeners from around the world, welcome to another episode of Miami Global Net. For this episode, we're glad to have once again the European American Chamber of Commerce for our deep dive series. I have here Christina and Mike. I'm going to hand it over to Christina to introduce our guest. And here we go.
Thank you, Alejandro. Hello, my name is Christina Slezinska, and I'm the Executive Director of the EACC Florida. We're the Florida chapter of the European American Chamber of Commerce, a platform where Americans and Europeans connect to do business. EACC provides education and updates on regulatory and legal developments of relevance to the transatlantic business community. We organize events on issues of interest to our constituency and offer unique connections and networking opportunities. We are very happy to partner with Miami Global Net on this podcast series of deep dives focusing on big picture issues and how they affect the transatlantic business activities. As we emerge from a global pandemic where economic activity took a massive hit, the economy is now rebounding, and some businesses are again considering whether to expand their operations to other places. For this deep dive on expanding operations, we have a wonderful guide, Mike Morroni, who will share with us what the key triggers are when deciding to expand to another country and what key factors business leaders need to consider when making the decision to move operations to another jurisdiction. Mike is the Global Clients Leader and North America Head of Business Development at TMF Group, a world-leading independent professional services provider with a wholly owned network of 125 offices across 83 countries. TMF has 5 offices in the United States, including right here in Miami, and TMF Group is a founding member of EACC Florida. So now, without further ado, I'll pass the floor to Alejandro Cervalli, our host here at Miami Global Net.
Thank you very much, Christina. Mike, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us. How are you doing today?
Thank you. I'm doing great, Alejandro. Thank you for having me. Glad to be on your show here and back in Miami as well. I've just moved back. I had been here before and moved back about 9 months ago. So glad to be here.
Welcome back. Welcome back. What brought you back?
I loved living here. I was here and then had an opportunity to move to Europe and to Switzerland for about 3.5, 4 years. But the plan was always to come back, and so came back to be part of with TMF. I've been with us the whole time, but came back to be part of the leadership team here in North America. But also my wife and I love it here, so that's a big part of the reason.
Awesome. Wonderful. What got you into the space you're in now?
Sure. So I was into the first kind of half of my career was really focused on more financial services, always international, always had a kind of desire for that. I did my MBA in Europe, spent a lot of time, about 6-7 years living in London. But then I did a stint working for a company who does political and security consulting, actually, and helping companies go into new countries. And then about 8 years ago, I found TMF, which is kind of very similar in helping companies go into new countries and understand how to operate there. And really for the past 8 years, I've just really enjoyed it. Every day, it's a new conversation about which European country someone might come into, someone coming from Europe to the U.S. So it's really been a bit of a combination of career choice and passion for kind of international business, international travel, et cetera.
That's great. Well, you're definitely in one of the great places for international business and community and city. One of the largest, I would say, in that space. Having Latin America at our footsteps, and now the world as we become more interconnected, which is great why we're having this topic, because it's all about doing business and expanding overseas, right? So let's dive right in. So why should companies expand overseas?
Sure. So, I mean, a lot of times, companies might have different reasons for doing it, right? So you could have that, you could have a U.S. company who has maybe, either saturated their market in the U.S. and they're looking for new opportunities, or they're still doing very well in the U.S., but they know that, okay, there's a big market for them in a specific European country, or in general, they want to start getting a footprint in Europe. Maybe their competition's going there as well. Also, you could get the opposite, right? A European company who's looking at the U.S. thinking, hey, we know there's a big opportunity there. How do we go in? How do we do it? Now, there could be other reasons, right? Especially in the current market, where people looking for employees is actually challenging. It's hard to find, really good people. So often, companies might be looking for, okay, in my market, I'm having trouble finding the staff I want. So, let me look in another country, another location, or where there's a skill set, right? So, for example, in Miami, there's, a variety of different skill sets you may not find in other parts of the U.S., especially with the combination of people having knowledge of Latin America as well. So, people looking for those. And lastly, kind of two final ones. One is there may be supply chain reasons, especially with COVID. People saying, okay, I had set up in one country, all of a sudden COVID hit, that shut me down. I now need to diversify my supply chain. And the big one, which sometimes isn't even intentional, is a merger and acquisition. So, for example, you may have a large European company who acquires another European company, and it just so happens that that company has an office and location in Miami, right? Now, all of a sudden, it might not have been part of the strategic acquisition, but now they're here, right? And they're looking at that and how do they maximize that? So sometimes M&A can play a key role in putting a company into new locations that have them expand quite quickly.
So I like that when you mentioned saturating your market, it sparked another one of the things you mentioned. You said saturation, finding employees, supply chain reasons, and mergers and acquisitions. Yep. I was thinking, what about testing markets too? I was in
absolutely.
London. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's.
I was in London once, and my friends from Peru were tapping their credit cards, and I was like, I don't have that. Why don't I have that? And I called Citibank, and I was like, hey, why am I not tapping my credit card like my friends? So I'm like, sir, it's okay. We're testing in smaller markets. And I was like, okay, I'll accept that.
That's a good one. It's funny because now moving back from Europe, I have multiple times left my credit card in a restaurant because I was so used to just tapping my card, and then now you've got to put it in the sheet. They take it away otherwise. And I think probably in the last 9-10 months, there's probably been about 6 different times where I've had to run back to the restaurant because I forgot my credit card.
Is it very common for companies to test in other markets like that, or is it just like?
Yeah, no, I think definitely, especially the U.S. being such a massive market, right? If someone's going in, it's also good to test in a specific city, right, or a specific market, because you want to figure out are things going to go right, and are there some things you need to tweak to do that, and especially when and you could see that someone going into Europe, right? They may say, okay, let me try X country first, right, or try going into here first before we go full-blown plan, which can be more complex and more expensive. Same with the US, right? If you go into a lot of states at once, not just from a reputation and making sure that things are working right, but also from a regulatory perspective, you all of a sudden need to register in those states. You need to, there's a lot more complexity to what you need to do. So it has 2 advantages. One gives you that test, but also kind of lowers the complexity of what you're trying to do.
Got it. And these reasons, a saturation of the market, finding employees, skill sets, supply chain reasons, mergers and acquisitions, testing, does it vary by size of the company?
So I think it can, in the sense of how the company approaches it, right? So if you have a large company, let's say who's already operates internationally, right? But they're just going into a new market. They'll have some experience in doing that. They may have advisors, like us, like their law firms, et cetera, who help them kind of navigate through that. And so the kind of way they go about it, they may have kind of a set process and a plan, but it also, at the same time, they're going to have kind of internal processes, which means, okay, we've set up, we're a big European company, we run Workday for our HR, or SAP for our finances, and now we need everything from that new market to flow into what we do, right? It can create a lot of complexities from that side, but also for them, depending on how important that move into the market is, it might also not get the attention of senior management, right? And meaning it doesn't have that kind of big focus, and they need someone to help them on the ground. Whereas a smaller company, right, there's normally a lot that might ride on that decision, right? If you're a small company and this is the first time you're going into a new market, you need to make sure that it's got your full attention, it's going right, you've got really good people helping you to achieve your goals on that. And it probably has the attention of the CEO on a very frequent basis, right? Hey, is this going well? And the risk is higher, right? If that goes wrong, it could set the company back, right? So I think it does differ depending on the size in terms of how you think about it, but there's also similarities. I mean, you still need to deal with the same regulations, deal with the same timeframes, et cetera.
You mentioned leadership. What are some of the key things they need to consider before making a move overseas?
Yeah. So, I mean, the natural things that companies tend to look at, are, is there obviously a market opportunity for them if that's the reason they're going in? Is there a demand for their service? They also need to consider the workforce, right? So, if they're a consulting company and they're going into a new company, will they be able to hire consultants on the ground who have the background they need? Or if they're a, production, will they be able to hire those people? And of course, the competition in the market and the demographics, right? So those are kind of core business areas, but some of the things that are often, let's say, overlooked by, especially if the decision to go in is a very kind of commercial business development type decision, are the complexities of that market, right? So at TMF, we've just recently launched what we call our global complexity index. And this looks at 77 countries around the world, what makes them more complex, what makes them less complex to operate in. And what we tend to look at there is kind of in that complexity, what are the things that, let's say the time to go to market, in order to set up a business, is most of the business done in English, right? Or in a universal language? What does the employment law look like? What do the different areas look like that make it complex to operate? And these can really impact a business. Some countries you can set up an entity and be operating pretty quickly in a week or two. Some it might take 9 months, 12 months, and that can impact your business plan. And when we look at, for example, Europe versus the US or other countries in Europe, for example, places like France, Turkey, Poland, they're towards the top of our complexity index, meaning that they are more complex to operate. It doesn't mean that they're not attractive markets. They're absolutely attractive markets. Most of our clients who are operating in Europe operate in these locations, right? But it means a company needs to be ready for those complexities. There's business risk. There's actually even risk to employees if you make them directors. In some cases, there's countries that will, literally have, the potential for someone to go to jail or even worse, right? If you don't comply with different laws, right? So there's those risks they need to take into account. But then there's other places like, Denmark, for example, is our least complex place to do business. Ireland, Netherlands, and Europe, and the U.S. actually is towards the bottom of the list in terms of least complexity. And so, I think those factors can definitely impact the kind of the way that you need to plan to operate when you go abroad. And specifically thinking about the U.S., even the state matters. Right, and I think that matters as well in terms of where you're looking to operate your business.
I like that you're talking about timing, and I'm sure that's extremely important. What about recent events? Should we keep in mind, or in your view, how does that look like? How are they influencing these steps companies want to take?
Yeah, no, I think it's a big recent events. I don't think any of us have had a conversation in the last year and a half without mentioning COVID or its impacts, right? And I think the recent events have mattered, right? So when you look at, for example, the world was already becoming a more complex place with some things coming in like nationalism in certain countries and some rules coming in to more protect employees or protect kind of homegrown businesses, as well as regulations coming in to make sure that companies are kind of having global compliance and global reporting, right? But then when you kind of put on top of that, you bring in the fact that a lot of countries have spent a significant amount of money trying to support their economies and support their people due to COVID. And I think as we go forward, we're already seeing that countries are changing their legislation, in other words, to make sure that the companies that operate in their country, foreign ones as well as local ones, are complying with the rules, obviously generating more tax income, right, which will help them pay for different programs. And we can expect to continue this to happen. So companies really need to be on top of that, understanding what those implications could be. Just because the rule is one thing today, when you go into a new country, it may not be that in 6 months, right? You need to be ready to, to adapt to really what is a changing environment. So it definitely has added some extra complexity. The other complexity it's added is, well, and up until recently, at least, especially if you're a European trying to come to the US, coming and doing due diligence on the ground or moving an expat in has been incredibly hard for the past 1.5 to 2 years, right? So that's meant, a lot of Zoom calls and a lot of, different ways of looking at things, but, you obviously don't get the same feel as if you were, on the ground doing your own due diligence.
So when you mentioned COVID, of course, the United States, the Europeans have have had travel bans. We still have them, I believe since spring 2020, and the EU has eased their travel ban, and the US is planning to do that in November.
Yeah.
How does that impact the planning companies are doing?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really interesting one because I was having this conversation around M&A the other day with somebody, and a lot of, for example, the M&A that takes you into new markets, you see a lot of it in the tech space, right? And if you think about that, that's, one is because those companies are, doing well in the current market, right? They tend to have more cash rich side of it, but also there's less due diligence needed on the ground if you're acquiring something that, doesn't have a factory or doesn't have, a physical presence, right? So, I think that's had an impact of how people kind of move and the type of due diligence they do, but then also just on a people perspective, there are quite a few, people I know who are, let's say, Europeans who are planning to move to Florida. Their company had planned to move them here, and they haven't been able to do it for the last 1.5 years. And those are senior management positions, right? And often, especially when people are making that first move into a new country, in the past, you've seen they'll send that expat in, right? To kind of be there for the first year or two, to kind of bring the company's culture, to bring kind of victor. And that's just been a challenge to do, right? So, either hiring locally or having people work virtually has kind of become the norm. I'm super excited that the U.S. has finally, decided to, open the borders, and I hope it stays. Even from a, personal reason, my wife is German, right, and it's been a challenge, right, seeing families, and I think there's also people who've been stuck in that from a business perspective. Maybe an expat who moved over before their family could move over and got stuck in the middle of it, right? So I think on a personal level, there'll be things that help us all as individuals, but also help businesses.
And at an overall level for transatlantic trade, do you anticipate any long-term effects?
I think the long-term effects kind of from a transatlantic trade are going to be, really on how companies plan and adapt, in my view, right? So we mentioned supply chain earlier, right? I think anybody who's dealing in, construction right now, or even trying to buy a car, right, or trying to do anything that requires chips or otherwise, is realizing that, the supply chain has been really strained in the last 1.5 years, and there's been delays. And I think a lot of companies are looking at, okay, how do we adjust for that, right? Would opening up in another location give us the ability to really adapt to that? So if one area is strained, we can move production, right? Or is, if we, for example, are in a country where we've really been hit hard from a consumer market perspective because maybe stores haven't been open, if we then have a presence in, somewhere that's been more open, like a Florida, for example, right? That may be a benefit to our business, because when one area is not doing well, the other one is. And I actually had a conversation with a client the other day who, they're a global company in kind of fashion retail. And, I think when you look at what they do, right, you've got, Asia's actually come back pretty strong for them, done really well. US has actually done pretty well, and Europe, is mixed depending on really kind of what the rules have been in terms of shopping and what you can do and otherwise, right? But being the fact that they were in multiple markets allowed them to balance things, right?
So I like that you mentioned Florida. We are in Miami, down here in South Florida. So why should European companies choose Florida, Miami specifically?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a great question. And anybody in Miami has, seen in the news, a big influx of companies coming here, which is great to see. I think I saw an article the other day that ranked both Miami and Tampa as one of the areas where there's a lot of businesses moving into. So which is fantastic. Yeah, I mean, one comment I would make, right, is that any company, so a European company otherwise coming into the U.S., definitely should seek kind of tax advice or other advice, right, in terms of where they could be located and what that should mean to them. And I'm personally not a tax advisor, so I'll say that up front. But I think when you look at kind of Florida and Miami, and you start comparing it to kind of doing business overall in the U.S., right, and the attractiveness of doing it, right. You've got we talked a little bit about that access to Latin America, Central America. A lot of companies are here for that. The diversity, the multilingual population, right. You've got certain areas where there's a lot of real estate investment, right, and booming growth on the tech side. But also, you have other things that, can make it attractive. So you've got, employees, and hiring employees right now is one of the hardest things that a lot of companies are facing, right? So, in Florida, you've got, well, part of the reason I'm here, right, is I came here because it's an attractive place to live, not just from a weather perspective or otherwise, but you've also, if you compare it to other states from a tax perspective, right, it's a good place for people to be. But then when you look at it from an employer perspective, and I was looking at some stats that come from the Tax Foundation in terms of different states and how they rank, and they actually ranked Florida 4th overall as a state in terms of forming an LLC and operating that LLC. And what's interesting when you look at that is the 3 states that were ranked ahead of Florida, Wyoming, South Dakota, and Alaska, obviously are much smaller demographic, right? Much smaller population. And when you look at those kind of big population states outside of Florida, they tended to be towards the bottom of that list, right? So Florida has that combination of one, being large population state, quite attractive from having that diversity of population, but also, really has gone out of their way to be attractive to businesses, from whether it's from a tax perspective or from a setting up perspective. And I know that, for example, the European American Chamber of Commerce, works a lot with companies who are looking at how they come in, and really, working with various teams here to help them set up. And I think there's a lot of that support in coming to Miami. Miami's kind of very open for that and wanting people to come in and operate here. So for me, I think it's a great place to be. I'm super happy that our kind of, we've got a big office down in Brickell, and I look forward to the days when, there's a lot of activity of everybody going back into their offices, because it's definitely a buzz that's happening around Miami.
Oh, for sure. Once we get over this pandemic, and then the international community here in Miami was very, very robust, and still is. Yep. But I know Christina can for sure testify the activities and the delegations and the movement of international is huge. And it's awesome because everybody wants to connect, everybody's friendly, everyone wants to grow. So, so if I'm a company in Florida, are there any countries in Europe that are more beneficial for me?
Sure. So, I mean, I think in terms of what's beneficial to operate in really does depend on the company and what you're trying to do, right? So, if someone is trying to open up, shared service centers across Europe to help them go into, Eastern Europe, for example, they might be looking at one type of country. If they're trying to get into, retail to sell into, a specific market like Germany or France, right? That might be attractive to them. So the attractiveness from a kind of business and sales perspective is one thing. In terms of the attractiveness of ease of doing business and maybe it being a little bit more like the US to understand and operate, whether from a language perspective, that's where, we look at it as what's the level of that complexity. So, I'd mentioned earlier, the Ireland's, they make it quite easy to set up and operate. Denmark was another one that makes it, easy to set up and operate. Now, some of the, more complex countries, like a France, it doesn't mean that it's not attractive. It just means that you need to be understanding of the local culture's norms, the employment law, in order to be successful, right? And so I think the the complexities are less about making it more or less attractive, and just being that a company needs to make sure that they have a good understanding of what they are, so that they can be successful in those markets. I mean, of course, you've got some great markets in Europe, that are, with growth, with big populations, that are very attractive to Florida and U.S. companies as they go into them. And of course, and we didn't mention this earlier when we talked about the travel opening up. Obviously, in South Florida, we've got a big tourism market, right? And that market across Europe opening back up is huge potential and huge revenue, right? And I think that attractiveness of, both from a bringing people in, but also going there, is something that we hope to see pick back up quite a bit.
So I know that we are running out of time, and I have one more question for you. Are there any other events we should keep our eyes on when considering expansion?
Yeah, so I think there's obviously a lot going on in the world. When we look at kind of European companies coming into the U.S., for example, you of course have the Biden administration looking to put their mark on things in various acts going through Congress at the moment, which could impact tax, right? It could impact where there's investment as well, right? So where companies could get investment to help them. There's also something that's called the Corporate Transparency Act, which is basically looking at what companies need to put forward in terms of their ownership directors and other elements that they need to make sure they're following. And that's something new that's coming in next year. So, just really companies need to, work with experts who can help them make sure that they're following those regulations, so that they can focus on, their core business, right? In terms of whether it's sales or otherwise in operating. Going the other way, so U.S. companies going to Europe. Of course, there's a lot of current events happening. There's upcoming elections. The German election just happened, and they're looking at forming the new government, which will be different than the past one that's been there for quite a long time, right? It'll remain to see what their policies are, but I think it's important that people do keep an eye on it. And of course, we've had Brexit in the news for the past many years, and still the kind of trade negotiations and things like that are still kind of going through the process. Now at TMF, we've actually moved the UK down our complexity index as a little bit less complex than previous years, because some of that is starting to work itself out. But it's definitely something to watch in terms of those types of things across European companies, especially as people come out of or continue to manage the situation with COVID. It could definitely have an impact on their policies and where they go.
Awesome. Mike, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. I think it's a key topic here in South Florida, especially Miami. And of course, thank you to the EACC, Christina. It's awesome that you always bring these interesting topics that hit at home. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro, for inviting us, EACC Florida, to partner with Miami GlobalNet on this deep dive on expanding operations. And many thanks to Mike Morroni from TMF Group here in Miami for sharing your really interesting insights and expert advice. So you can find further details about our guest, Miami GlobalNet, and EACC Florida in the podcast notes. Please check EACC Florida's website for upcoming programs and information on how to join. Very important, and subscribe to Miami GlobalNet to find out more about Miami's international community.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.